You guys should be all set. Ken, I don't know if you're muted or not, but we can't hear you.
No, still can't hear you, Ken.
You might have to reconnect.
Not yet. No, still not yet, Ken. No, not yet. I heard you say, how about now, but I can read lips. Yeah, want to try to disconnect?
Yeah, I would leave and come back in, Ken, and see if that makes any difference for you.
How are you, Rachel? I'm good.
I'm good. How are you guys?
Well, thanks. While we're waiting for Ken, at the high school, a lot of the kids did take advantage. I don't know what the end of the week will be like, but they took advantage of the outdoor spaces. So they were definitely using those, the tents and the picnic tables. Some of the kids were seated at some of the chairs. It was good.
That is good.
They were spread out for the most part.
Because it was nicer out today, right?
It was actually at one point, it was really warm out. And then all of a sudden it started to rain.
Okay.
Okay, now you're on mute, Ken. Give it a try.
All right, how's that? Is that better?
Beautiful.
Okay. All right, so anyway, sorry about that. It is 6:03, so why don't we call to order the Board of Ed Budget, Finance, and Operations Committee meeting. We could jump right in and let's start with the financial report ending March 31st, 2021. And why don't you start us off there, Ms. Norton?
Okay, happy to. Good evening. As of March 31st, 2021, we have expended or obligated $97,258,000 of our $99.9 million budgeted appropriation. This represents about 97%. It does include the first excess cost reimbursement of $716,950. And starting in March, we start to look towards the end of our fiscal year and start preparing for our final reporting that we do for the state. As we begin the final quarter to our fiscal year, we are also taking into consideration that all of our schools, or we're striving to keep all of our schools open in full enrollment. Then with that, we need to be able to support the students, the curriculum, the buildings, and the faculty. And it has been an odd year, of which I'm sure everybody is well aware. One of the things that I want to make very clear as we go through and look at the different financial reports that I have before you, that we would not have had the savings in our budget to do any of to cover the non-unbudgeted COVID expenses or do any of the year-end teaching that we need to do for our students who've been out of school for so long. Had it not been for COVID and the various restrictions and executive orders that were placed upon us, including the distance learning that some of the students had chosen to do, or that we have had to do due to the densities within our schools. My report is pretty much the same as you have seen in the past. The one area that I have added to the report is technology. I thought it was really important to start bringing technology forward to keep that in the forefront of everybody's mind at this point, because there are so many changes in technology that are required at this point for us that are very necessary in order for the students to take the tests for the state. I know that I had brought the approval to you for the purchase of the various Chromebooks that were needed in order for the students to do the testing and to have enough Chromebooks for students whose Chromebooks were beginning to date out. And so I wanted to bring that into the forefront of the report itself. Pretty much the technology department has completed their initial assessment of the current student devices and made their first purchase, as I had just mentioned, for the Chromebooks needed to administer the state testing for the Smarter Balance assessment and the next generation science standard. There will be a need to purchase more Chromebooks as the initial, or they move past their initial assessment into where they think they need to be. One of the couple of the problems is the devices are not available. Vendors are having shortages. It's harder to get the equipment that we're looking for. But Dr. DeSantis is keeping a very close eye on that. He's got his wish list out there. He's letting everyone know that he has needs. And as we go through the rest of the final quarter, we'll work as hard as we can to try to keep up with the demands of what the students need, bringing everybody back, and to get a good start on a program that has pretty much phased itself out, where we have so many old Chromebooks that just are outdated. They're not being serviced anymore. A lot of the applications don't continue to work on them. And there was really never a good replacement process for the technology department, which is now being put in place. You'll see that if you look at the projection report, you'll see where I have started to show a little bit more of where year end is projected to be. You'll see that there is areas that we have had savings due to various reasons. And then we have areas where we're projecting that there'll be overspent budget areas. So we at this time are still projecting that we will be spending all of our budget in order to purchase all that is needed and to cover the overages that we have already incurred due to the COVID. And we do feel that we still will be able to cover all of the COVID expenses, the unbudgeted COVID expenses. And as you can see here, most of the unbudgeted COVID expenses are within the facilities department. We chose to track everything on one account. As we get towards the end of the fiscal year, I have to start preparing all of my accounts for the state reporting. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to relocate those expenses into the individual departments for which the expenses occurred. I will still track it and still be able to report to you exactly what those expenses are. But on the projection sheet, you're going to see where technology is going to show the expense of the technology that was unbudgeted, that was purchased. Facilities will not show as much of a hit as it will be distributed amongst through. When I get to the COVID report, I'll show you exactly what you'll see and how that will look as it goes through. As the schools are working, one of the other areas that you'll start to see a lot of is on the transfers. As the schools work towards aligning their expenses with the needs of the students due to the teaching and distance learning that they have had to deal with throughout this past year, they have different needs than what they were actually budgeted for. Remember, when we set the budget for this year, COVID was not even a thought. And then COVID hit and a lot of changes had occurred. So when normally where they had budgeted all of their expenses would be where they normally would have spent that money had it been a normal year. With it not being a normal year, there's a required need to transfer money, and you'll see a lot of transfers coming through. You'll see some tonight, and then each meeting as we clean up the accounts and as the expenses, as the principals align their schools with what their needs are, there'll be more transfers. Let's see what else. Also, facilities has also been working really hard to start opening up the outside to get the tents up, the picnic tables up. They have also started to notice that in the schools where a lot of surfaces have been cleaned continually, these surfaces are starting to deteriorate, and so they are going to start looking at ways in order to fix the surfaces. So there'll be some expenses that were not projected or known until we started to see some deterioration on these surfaces.
So just to add some detail to that, Dawn, if you don't mind, what Dawn is describing is the desks and the cafeteria tables, for example, at the high school, because of the amount of cleaning that has, so the good news is we've done a good job cleaning. The side note to that is that unfortunately, due to that rigorous amount of cleaning, the surfaces of those tables and or desks are basically deteriorating. And so we have a choice to look at the furniture that's on the newer side, how it can be resurfaced, and the furniture that's older, we would likely replace because it's not worth trying to pay and resurface it. So we're budgeting that both of those pieces out. But that is something that, while we didn't anticipate, but it's most significant at the high school. And having been up there today at the Student Center, you can really see the significance of how that's happened over time. I apologize, Dawn. I just wanted to make sure I added that.
No, thank you. So I wanted to just walk you through a little bit of the projections just to go over some of the areas that, and all of these will shift and change as actuals occur and as the needs. These are really just discussions of projection, discussions of where we think we're going to need some money and where we think we're going to be spending some money. Some of it is a little bit more accurate than others because I do have transfers that I'm bringing for you tonight. If they are approved through the board on next Monday night, then these expenses will actually occur. But if you look, you'll see that the salary lines, which is the first 6 lines, there's a savings in those lines, and the savings is due to the turnover that we've had throughout the year. Short-term disability is only paid at 2/3 versus paid at full pay. So there was lots of short-term disability. Workers' comp is the same thing. Unpaid leave, we had a great deal of unpaid leave as individuals chose not to come to work for whatever reason their personal reasons were. And we also had disabilities. Besides short-term, we had some disabilities where individuals were out for an extended period of time and they weren't receiving their actual pay, so there was some savings. We also had some key positions that were filled a little bit later in the year, and there was some savings we realized there. And then we had some state or federal executive orders that came down. One of them was the FMLA. I believe it's considered extra. In other words, you can be out on family medical leave, not hurt your position or your salary, but you wouldn't be paid your full amount. You'd be taking at a lower pay. So all of that added up to a pretty good savings in that area. Along with the turnover, that's where we're seeing most of those savings on those lines. In addition, you'll see that there is a savings on the sub line. That is because of the grants that we received. We moved money off of the sub line for the non-certified salaries and moved it against the grant. So when we had the building subs that we hired specifically for COVID in order to support the teachers in the schools and the paras, those expenses were moved and covered by the grants that we had received. So it came out of the salary line and it was charged against the grant. So you'll see that's where the savings is on that line. Medical benefits, that's just basic turnover that we've been seeing, use of the medical benefits in our 2 fully funded plans. We just haven't had the claims hit us as much as we had. We do expect that those claims will be coming now that doctors' offices are open and people are getting their procedures done. We do expect to spend all of our money on the FICA Medicare and in all of the schools. And the additional spending in the schools is what's throwing those individual schools over. That's part of what you'll see coming up with the transfers that we have. On the special education line, we are showing quite a large over on special education, and that's due to some settlements that are starting to complete. We anticipate that there are 2 more settlements that are not amongst these numbers for about $300,000 more that will, you'll see that that's under the additional spending, and that will be needing to cover special education in that area.
Dawn, can I just ask a question on that? So the
Sure.
300,000 that's in additional, is those additional 2 settlements, or it's in another 300 on top of that?
That's our estimate for those 2 that haven't been settled yet. We think it's going to come in somewhere around there. Don't know for sure exactly what it'll be finally settled at, but that's for the 2 that we don't have documentation on.
Okay. And on that line item, are those settlements then completely paid this year, or are we going to see another incremental fee next year for an additional payment?
It all depends on the settlement and what that final agreement is.
Some of them, Liz, may be multi-year agreements. And so then you wouldn't see it, and others may not be.
So we don't know yet.
That's right. And the other piece here is excess cost. Dawn, I just don't want to make sure you didn't miss that.
Nope. And I have a placeholder of a possible 238,700 in additional revenue coming from the state for excess costs. That's what I think that is going to come in based on communications with the state of Connecticut, and estimating that it's going to be about a 78% reimbursement, or 87% reimbursement. So that would bring us about to that amount of money. So we'll still be a little bit short in that area. We could get more. And then that would help us, and that would change the dynamics of that line as well.
Dawn?
Yep.
Just to further clarify what Liz was saying, so that 300,000, we don't know, obviously, just looking at this number, that's 300,000 for this year. If it's a multi-year settlement, that could be an additional 100 next year.
Correct.
From that settlement. This is
Actually, no, if it's a multi-year, I'm sorry, Ken, if it's a multi-year settlement, it's done. So you would see, let's just say that a multi-year settlement was $300,000, then you would see it in this budget, and you would not see that. You wouldn't know that because you don't know the individual cases, but you would not see that come through again next year.
It all depends on how the settlement is written up and what the requirements are that are signed on.
Okay, so just to clarify that, so how would that work if we're required to pay tuition at a Eagle Hill for 4 years? All of that would be in this year's budget?
So if it was a multi-year settlement, and that's the way the agreement was written, it would be fully settled within this budget. If that's the way it was written, it just depends on the way they're written.
Okay, and how do we determine those estimates? Is that our lawyers give us those, or?
Yeah, you'll notice, I think year to year, we've been keeping the same estimate. And so that's based on a pattern that we've seen over time.
Okay, so we've established that pattern. Okay, thank you.
Great. Moving through, you'll see that there's an anticipated another 411,000 or so in additional spending. That is the amount that included in that 400 are the 2 agreements that I had brought before you for approval at the full board. Those haven't happened yet. So this is March. They happened in April. So that's why you see that additional on the additional line and not actual expense there. School lunch program, we're still estimating. That may change now that we have more students in the schools. Hopefully more students purchase lunches. And facilities is the other one that's carrying the larger on a lot of that is still the COVID that's on that line. And the rest of his projects and whatnot. So that's kind of where it is. And this is the type of review that I'll be showing you each of the months now as we go through the end of the year, as we finalize some additional spending as approvals for transfers passed through the board. and where we think we're going to be projecting our final year end. Any specific questions more on that?
If there are no questions, do we want to move on to transfers? Miss Norton again.
Okay, there is a lot of transfers. What you'll see on these transfers is there's a little bit of a pattern. This is where the schools have found that when in March of last year, when buildings were closed and there was no one allowed in the buildings, a lot of material had to go home with the students. A lot of materials had to go in order for them to do distance learning from home. As schools open back again in the fall, still students were working from home, still students were doing distance learning, and then you had your cohort A and B that were shifting in and out of the school. So a lot of materials that were in the schools, a lot of books, a lot of equipment went home so that they could continue with their learning structures in their home. And so there's a lot of replacement that has to happen, especially now that the students are coming back in. A lot of the materials were either damaged to the point where they're not good and we do have to replace them, or they're still being used from some who are still doing distance learning and they're not in the schools. So what you'll see on almost all of the schools is some transfers, and we chose to do transfers from the salary lines into the library, media area, the maker space, art, music, and PE areas. So those are the areas that they felt that they needed to shore up their equipment, their materials, and their supplies. Starting off, go ahead.
If you don't mind, just to summarize. So essentially, what we naturally knew would happen is as our cohort A and B hybrid children came in and out of school, they would take materials home, bring them back. Some of the materials came back in great condition, other materials just natural, right? What happens with a lot of back and forth and usability that comes with every content area. And then certainly our cohort C children have not returned. And so therefore those materials we're counting on as well. So what we're looking to do now is look across every content area, K-12, look at those materials across all of those settings and identify what needs to be replaced for now, for this year, and then certainly for years to come, but what would have been in our schools before COVID. And let's use any additional funding that we have in salaries to prepare our kids for this spring. If they need materials to go home, that's fine too for the summer, but certainly have everything that they need. And so that's really across every single content area. So Dawn spoke to a few, but the math materials at the elementary level, for example, the blocks, all of those manipulatives that you would expect children to go home with. Some of those came back, some of them didn't, some came, just parts of them come back. So those are the transfers that you're seeing now. And I anticipate that you'll see them over the next couple of months, is to allow for those replacements. Books in particular, that was a real issue at the high school, getting all of our books back, getting them replaced, and having the multiple copies that we need.
So if I run through the transfers, starting off, the high school had a request of $10,425 to be transferred from a couple of various areas, mostly all transportation areas, into graduation expenses. They prep for the expenses they feel they're going to have with graduation being, I believe it's down at Tiger Hollow Stadium.
So we've transitioned from Western, and we'll have our high school graduation where I believe it belongs anyway, at the high school.
Then they also had a request for instructional materials school-wide for their learning common rooms. And they are moving those from some local mileage that they had budgeted for the exchange students and membership administration. Obviously there wasn't much mileage that was done because there was really no traveling. And the exchange students didn't occur due to the COVID situation. And memberships, a lot of memberships were covered or given to us for free because of the COVID situation. So there was money that was left in those areas. And so they are looking to move that money, 5,764 of it, into their materials, instructional materials school-wide for supplies needed for their common rooms. And then the last request that the high school had back in March was, or the report's March here, but we're in April, was oceanography. They did not do any trips for oceanography, so $3,755. They're asking to have that moved to instructional materials science, and that is to support instructional materials and equipment that are needed in the science area. And you want me to just keep going? And if there's a question, you guys to stop me? Okay.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. Facilities had a request back in March for some HAZVAC supplies that were needed. So they chose to move or request to move $4,000 from maintenance materials to HAZVAC supplies in order to get the motor, the parts for the motor that they needed for their system. Scotch Ridge Middle School had a request of transferring $725 from textbook math and $200 from membership math as to move to instructional materials math. They have a need of $925 for additional teacher supplies requested by the various department heads. Membership world language at Scotch Ridge Middle School, $406 was a request to transfer that to materials world language instructional for additional instructional materials needed, and the membership wasn't needed because the membership, the dues weren't charged this past year. Same with social studies, memberships were not needed, $126. A request was asked to move that to instructional materials, social studies for additional instructional materials, and the memberships wasn't needed. In April, the high school, this is where you'll start to see this is where the principal started seeing what their needs were and then started pulling together the transfers that they felt they needed in order to cover some of the areas. The high school teacher's salary of $20,000 moved $10,000 to instructional materials art and $10,000 to instructional materials music. And that is to replenish instructional materials and equipment both for art and music that were lost or damaged during the past fiscal year. Scotch Ridge Middle School, textbooks world language, $263.50. They asked to have that transferred to instructional materials world language, textbooks to instructional materials for additional instructional materials needed. And I might have a wrong account on there because their reasoning was the membership was provided for free. Let me just make sure I check that one. Teacher salaries, $10,000, transferred to materials library, $10,000, and that is to replace lost damaged books due to remote learning and to get some makerspace materials. Music accompanist, $500 to instructional materials for music, and that is no concert was performed. So the music accompanist wasn't needed. The funds are needed for additional materials for instruction in music. And then also under Scotch Ridge Middle School, $20,000 from teachers' salaries to $5,000 to materials for art and $15,000 for materials for physical education. In Eastridge, teacher salaries of 10,000, to library collections of 10,000. East Ridge as well, student assembly pride and instructional materials school-wide, $500 and $400. So $900 they were looking for a transfer into their office supplies for the MakerBot 3D printer. They also
Can I just
asked,
ask a question on that one? So do we have a MakerBot at CERMS as well?
Liz, I can double check, but I think that's part of the maker space. So I'll double check to see if we have one of those. A lot of the times the library media specialists do identify the materials that their students are interested in, or so that's traditionally how that's worked. I'll double check to see whether or not we have one at CERMS as well.
Okay.
They do have the potential if they wanted to make a transfer this year. They could have used that for their maker spaces because many of the schools are refurbishing some of the materials there. So I don't know that there's been a desire, but I'll double check that.
Okay, thank you.
and then they had a few small transfers that they asked for, $20 from reading, $270 from equipment music, $13 from PE, just to clean up some accounts, but they were really trying to move that money into instructional materials school-wide in order to purchase support needs for returning students in the social emotional area.
What kind of, do we know what kind of, I mean, this is a little vague, and my concern with some of these transfers is every single penny is being transferred into something else. We're not harvesting any money. And that's a little concerning, and it seems to be a theme here. So I just want to make sure that we're actually digging into what these transfers are and not saying because we have the money, we're going to spend it, because it feels a little bit like that. And I'm starting to grow more and more uncomfortable as we go through this with the level of detail that's not there in terms of, did we plan to do any of these things? I get it. Some materials are starting to degrade because of cleaning supplies. I get that. But if we just start buying stuff because we have this cash, I'm very concerned about that. That is not a good use of funds.
Liz, let me speak to a couple of things just quickly. Your maker bots, we have 2 at each middle school. So Dr. DeSantis was listening in, and so he just messaged that. So the answer to that question, the second one that you're questioning is around the PBIS materials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and I think if you bring up a good point about the transfers in general. And so there are a lot of resources, absolutely, that deteriorated over the past year and a half, right? There's no doubt there. There's also a lot of resources that our teachers could benefit from. And so therefore, having additional funding this year allows for the benefit to support our kids.
Yeah, but those are benefits that were approved in this last year's budget. And so I want to be really careful with what I'm saying right now, which is I have a list of things I want to buy too, but it's not our money, right? It was approved for specific purposes. And when you start to collect all these transfers and say, boy, last year the town allowed us to roll over some funds. Now we're going to use those funds for an open book of transfers back and forth because we have it. And we've all read, hey, it's my budget, I'm just going to go spend it because I'm not going to get it next year. That is not the way that these budgets are approved. And I just want to put on the record that I'm starting personally, this seems to me like we should be harvesting this money for next year. We don't know what additional PPE is going to be required. We don't know what additional costs we're going to incur. And a lot of this was from salary moves and things like that. We don't know if people are going to pile on to their doctor's office and dentist's office now that things are open. So I'm really, I get it. We want to go, oh, geez, I have $10,000. I want to go spend it and I want to get a third MakerBot. Great, kids will really benefit from that. But is that really what our taxpayers approved? And I just want to be I'm just putting it on the record. I'm not going to push back on any individual line item. But as these things start to add up, I would ask that the superintendent and Dawn, that you ask a lot of questions about, was this planned at any point? And what are these materials and not additional instructional materials? Because it's just very vague.
Yeah, just a couple of points, just to be clear, the non-lapsing fund was not used. So I know you brought that up, Liz. I just wanted to make sure that we all are.
And if we don't have money from this year, we should be giving it back to the town because they paid for things that now we're saying, but wait, there's a dozen things we want because we saved all this money. And I just think that's really onesie twosie, it's one thing, but when it starts to add up like this, it starts to become pretty uncomfortable.
Your point is a good point, Liz, and we do ask a lot of questions, and for the most part, a lot of this, and I'll ask for more specifics as the transfers come through as to exactly what they're going to be using it for, what specific instructional material school-wide is needed for this $1,400 and that kind of thing. I'll try to get more
strategy it supports would be my other ask, right? What strategy is this purchase supporting? Do we have something in the books that we already had sort of conceptually aligned on strategically, or is this just?
Yeah, Liz, I'll say this, that the transfer requests that our principals make are not random. So they're connected in some way to their curriculum or instruction or our goals. This is not just, yes, we're replacing makers in all of the areas that kind of feels slightly random, could be a makerspace because they are random materials. Outside of that, when you look at the replacements of instructional materials, mathematics, for example, the principals could tell you very specifically, I don't know that we should, this would become a binder.
Yeah, but you could at least do a summary that, hey, we're spending an additional $500,000 on makerspace improvements. That can be buried in these line items right now. And I haven't added them all up, but it could be easily buried in line item transfers. And all of a sudden we've got a makerspace investment that wasn't approved. So I just want, and I get it. I trust our principals, but I also know that if there's a budget, people are going to spend it, and it becomes the baseline for the next year and the next year and the next year. And we say, but we spent it all. And we have an obligation to question that. That is our job as a committee, and it is our job as a board.
Sure.
But also, and I could be wrong, but doesn't the board have to approve these transfers?
Only above 50,000, our transfers are, we cannot do anything with the transfers until the board does approve them. Up to 50,000, the superintendent can approve them, and only up to 10,000 can I approve them.
And that's individual.
But we do disclose them by bringing them all back to you at the board level.
Sure, but is that an aggregate or is that individual transfers?
Per transfer.
Each one.
So in other words,
so you could have 50 different line items for one area.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm concerned about, that all of a sudden we've now approved a program that we really didn't approve as part of the budget. And I'm not saying anyone's doing anything nefarious, but I do think that you guys owe it to us to have that view and talk through it with us.
Yeah, Liz, I'm hearing you, and I'm trying to process how that would look in a transfer. I think programmatically, if there was a change in program, let's just say that we were looking to purchase a whole new math program, you would not see that. I would hope that you would not see that in transfers, right? Because that's not what the intent of these are. So when we have a new program, that's something we come to the board with. The board either agrees that this is a great idea or not, and we budget or plan for that. It's a little bit different than transfers when we do have monies in our salaries that were intended for the school budget. And so right now, for example, let's just take technology. It's a great example. There is a significant amount of need in the area of technology. It would take us, as you know, from Dr. DeSantis's presentation a few weeks ago, that would take us years and years and years to be able to get to the place where we need to begin. So if we have the ability within an operating budget to make a transfer to purchase what our kids need, we'd like to be able to do that. Now,
yeah, I just think it needs to be mapped to that and not mapped to additional instructional materials, right? That may not even be for the class that they were attended, right? I'll go back to oceanography. I assume that those are oceanography materials and that we're supporting that program, but I don't know from that description. It could be going to a Spanish program. And I think that's not the intent of a transfer either. So I just want to be careful that we don't end up buying a bunch of technology stuff and burying it in 10,000 or less line items. That's what I'm asking. And so I think an executive summary of the major programs that we're investing and where we're pulling the money from makes sense. Even if you don't need specific approval for that, it's disingenuous not to pull them together that way. And I don't know that that's happening here, but when you see 3 pages of transfers, it starts to feel that way.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing you say, Liz, is that in addition to, because this does actually, it does get into the very small amounts to be transparent. So if you notice, you're seeing transfers of $400.
But varying in details, the plot, right?
That's
So part of this.
Yeah, so I think what we would need to process through is how then we can take line items like this and make a general without becoming listy, because I could sit here and list the 1,000 things that, someone's going to buy for their math program, which is blocks and Unifix cubes and clips and all, right? So I don't think you want that. That's not what you're asking
We
for.
want to know if we're investing in a new math program by using line items that are all up $999,000, right? That's what I'm trying to get to. And when you start to get to this many pages of transfers and you start to flip through them and you see, boy, I'm taking my sub fees out that were for substitute teachers and I'm using it for curriculum development for the summer program. That feels like something the community did not vote on. Not that it's a bad idea, but the community didn't vote on that as a budget line item. And so I just want to be really careful that we are being good stewards of the approved budget for the programs that were approved, and that we're being very transparent about what we're changing, that using taxpayer dollars to do it. Not that they're bad ideas, but that this was not in the budget last year and we've added it. And here's how much it's going to cost. It's not just 55,000 probably. It's probably a lot more than that. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Liz, if I can just jump in for a second.
Yeah.
I think you have a lot of valid points here. And I think that this conversation is worth a lively discussion at the next full board meeting. I think that we'll find some philosophical disagreements among board members as to whether the town approved a certain line or the town approved a certain amount for the education budget. I think it's worth talking more about that at the full board.
Okay. That's
That
fair.
makes sense.
And if I could just, please keep in mind that when the budget was set, we weren't in COVID. There was not even a thought that there was going to be. And I know what you're saying, Liz, and I appreciate that. I just want to know that the schools budgeted for certain things that now has changed.
I get it, but not all of this is due to COVID, right? It's savings found regardless of the reason being used for a purpose that wasn't discussed as part of the budget deliberations. So I think it's a philosophical, I think Jonathan's right, that it's a philosophical conversation, but COVID has nothing to do with it. If we saw 3 pages of transfers the year before, it would be the same question I would have.
Yeah, I think they're two different conversations that philosophically, certainly that's a conversation that the Board of Education can discuss at any time. And then I think there's another piece that you're asking about, Liz, which is, can you take all of this that you're putting on 4 pages and summarize what the patterns are, right? Because ultimately I can tell you, because I'm involved enough, that there's no instructional changes, shifts, right? We're doing within our operating budget the best that we can to support kids, which ultimately is our charge. There aren't any patterns of, okay, now we're adopting a new program without having gone through the board in some process. That's not happening here. So I think what you're asking for is perhaps even a summary sheet that says, okay, here are and especially at this time of the year, this is when you're going to see the most transfers, right? Because we're truing up
We're using up all our available dollars. And that philosophically is something that I look at and say, is that really the right thing to be doing overall? Or is there a better way to do that? I don't know. But
yeah, I think that there's 2 parts to that. I think it's partly what happens in a school budget is that you find out about transportation savings because you've had, and especially this year, right? But it still goes back to your point is that that's a philosophical conversation that the Board of Education can discuss and weigh in, and then you identify what you would like to charge us with. That's one piece. The second piece that I still think we have to come up with a way to communicate is there a way to take all of this and summarize it so we can see the categories? I think that's what you're asking for.
Yeah, the investment categories, right? If we've got, $1 million in lost materials, that is due to COVID, then let's call it that because it also should go on our COVID list, right? But we're transferring teacher salaries to go do it when maybe we would have been better off having another teacher. And I think that's where I start to go, oh, the picture isn't there,
Mhm.
where we've got the trees and not the forest, or whatever analogy you want to use. And so I appreciate you looking at ways to do that. That tells the story a little more globally.
Could it be something as simple as just even removing the school departments?
Well, it's funny because what happens with the way in which we do our transfers here, they are very specific, right? They're very specific by school and by line, really intended to be very transparent, right? So if you were to take, let's just take instructional supplies across the elementary level, you might see $60,000 in instructional supplies. To Liz's point there isn't anything like, oh, is there something going on over here? Well, no, what we're doing there is we're purchasing additional, libraries where our libraries may have not sustained the past year. We're buying additional books that our students might need. All of that's real, but it's broken down very specific for the interest of transparency, because if I'm a parent or a community member looking at my elementary school, I do want to know that they're getting the same amount as the school across town, excuse me. So that the level of transparency in this, I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, because it does really identify exactly where you're spending the money and where it's coming out of. I think what Liz is asking us to do is a little bit different, in that she's saying, I think what I'm hearing is that, yes, that specificity is fine, but I'm seeing a pattern here of transfer. So is there something that's happening that could be categorized in some way that allows us to see the broader picture?
And even if the reason for transfer includes a program that it aligns to, or this is replacement only of existing stuff we already had that we lost, versus, hey, this is net new material, like we're talking about the social and emotional supports, but what are they, right? What is this aligned to? So are we investing in a social worker? Are we investing in workbooks? Are we investing in posters? And what's the outcome? And because I think, at this point where we are with our budgets is they continue to grow. And I just want to make sure that the community is totally comfortable that we haven't kind of shifted the game a little bit when we start to talk about, well, we've got the money, we've got to use it. And that's all. And so that might be a way to do it. Just align each reason with some kind of strategic program or something.
Mm-hmm.
And Liz, in addition, adding on to your point here, this might also require the board to look at maybe amending the policies around transfers. None of these transfers hit that $50,000 mark, yet if we bucketed them differently, they might. So we might want to look at, as a board, are there other ways that we want to bring transfers to the board for approval?
That's fair.
And I think just with this level of detail, I think for the most part, at least how I'm reading this, we're seeing actually more of the why we're spending it to repairs due to COVID, materials due to COVID. So it actually is symptomatic of this year that we've had. I think I felt a little more of the discomfort that you're feeling last year when we got these pages of transfers at the end, and so I feel more comfortable this year than I did last year. But I think it's definitely a very valid point. I think, again, as Jonathan said, let's discuss it in front of the full board.
Yeah, I think it's where, listen, technology is a big issue for us, right? You heard what Dr. DeSantis came and shared. It will take us years and years and years. With the reality is it will, right? To try to keep our budget balanced, to look at other things outside of a computer, it's going to take us years and years and years. Are we in a position to say, when we have the money within our budget, which is a very unique year, because I would think in most years you wouldn't be in this position, when you have the money available in your budget, is this the time in which to do it? Some of which we have no choice, right? Our kids need the technology to take the test. We're doing what we need to do. But some of those other pieces, which are, in my opinion, not nice to have. The kids should have those boards in their classroom. That's the access to learning. That's just, to me, a basic fundamental outside of a whiteboard with a marker. Are we saying that, yes, we need to move forward with that now, even though really, if we were to talk philosophically, that wasn't, just to go back to Liz's point, that wasn't part of a grand plan for this year's budget when we started out, but yet clearly a necessity. And we've done a needs assessment. We've done the heavy lifting. It's a necessity. should we be investing in that now if we have the ability to do so outside of replacements and all the other COVID transfers that
Yeah.
you're seeing? If you're asking me, absolutely. And these are not, these are basic necessities in classrooms that we've gone many years without. But yes, it's going to require a transfer, and it wasn't exactly part of the grander plan at the start of the year, but certainly transparent. I think we've been transparent about what our needs are, or I hope that we've been transparent with the board and with the community about what our needs are. So I think it's certainly a discussion with this group or the larger group.
And I just said, so again, something else that Liz brought up. So there, when a principal requests a transfer, there's supporting documentation that they're providing, or there's more detail that they're providing?
Absolutely, because they have to go through the typical process anyway, right? They have to complete their requisition. So if let's say that they were to go and they wanted to purchase fancy math, right? And they put in a transfer from category A to category B to buy fancy math, we would deny that. Because before the transfer it wouldn't get signed off, because that transfer wouldn't be appropriate. Now, if you're saying you're buying resources for your libraries, those could be lots of different resources. So long as they support the curriculum that we have and the resources that in what we believe as an approach for our library media spaces and or our classroom libraries, those would be approved. And so we're seeing those requisitions as well, Ken. But when they would put in their request, if we just saw it like new math program, that would be denied.
Well, the point that I was trying to make was, if there was a particular thing, for example, Liz mentioned the supplies for social emotional support. If we were curious, okay, what exactly are those? That's a relatively easy thing for you to get and show us.
Absolutely. So we would know that those were related to either PBIS, responsive classroom, or ruler, right? Any request outside of those would likely be denied, unless they were saying, oh, you know what, we'd really love to pilot this. A couple of our teachers had some real issues with some children, and they thought that this strategy, and we might approve that as a professional development one offer. But
right. But if as a committee or as the board, we wanted to see that backup, that requisition, we could see that would be an easy thing to get to us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. That's where I was going. So if we went through here and there's 5 or 6 transfers that were, all right, that we're not really sure what that is, could you show us the support for that? That's something.
Absolutely. We could ask exactly what, because all of those, it's operational, of course, but we have all of the detail, the detail.
Rachel?
Just on Ken's point there. So if we look at East Ridge Middle School, they really took every penny and added it up here just to get $1,400. So I was wondering, because I understand the need to replace lost or damaged instructional materials. Scotts Ridge had $15,000 for instructional materials phys ed, but now East Ridge doesn't. Mm-hmm. So do they still need those materials? Right? I mean, it's the same district, children, hybrid. So if we found money in another area, could that money be transferred in if East Ridge needed it?
That's correct. So the adventure space, for example, is an area that East Ridge is working on in their space, but yet, and that money was already allocated there. Scotts Ridge was looking to enhance some of their spaces for their RISE students. They have a very specialized program at their school. So their physical education space, quote unquote, needs to look different for the population of children that they have. East Ridge is now working on that adventure space. You may remember we cut that out of next year's budget because we had the monies this year. So they didn't need those same monies, but they could perhaps need other resources. It's also, we're getting our kids back now. So we'll have a better sense of what things will look like once our kids are fully, today was their first day, and seeing what materials we really need. So we're ordering quickly also because we're getting a better perspective on things. And things are happening at a faster pace than they might normally happen, but that's a reality. And so you might see Scotts Ridge say, okay, we'd like to move some money from salaries to something else, because now we're seeing that need. And if we had the money to do that within our operating budget this year, without asking for the town to give us an appropriation of any kind or the non-lapsing fund, we would do that.
Right. And then, so with that perspective, Dr. De Silva, and I really appreciate that. So you didn't hear from East Ridge that they needed a certain amount of money at this point right now to cover instructional materials phys ed.
No, no. I actually spoke to the principal directly, and so that was not the case.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. But again, I think the really important piece here is that we would not be taking on a new initiative or a new approach. Anything that's existing, we support without coming to our board or going to a committee to say, you know what, we're looking at this A, B, or C. And so therefore we want to.
And just one final thing about sort of well, actually the disaggregation of the transfers. Are we in May, are we going to see another $20,000 from salaries? And then in June, another $20,000 in salaries from a particular school that maybe would have added up to $60,000 had it been done all at once? Can you keep an eye on that as we go forward?
You may, Ken, but it goes back to really identifying what the needs are as opposed to just making a blanket transfer. So if we had them make a blanket transfer, let's just say for $60,000 as you described, then that may not be based off of their needs. So
Right.
instead we would rather them say, okay, what is it that you need? So, okay. And, we did try to look at equity. So for the elementary math, for example, we knew that the kids have had their supplies at home. We knew that we needed replacement supplies even now. So we said, okay, what's a general amount? It's not exactly to the penny. We know that, right? You all know that. But generally speaking, on average, a class is 150, multiply that by however many sections, and that's how they got at that amount. So that's why you might see a few varied amounts, not exact, is because it's based off of the number of sections, or could be based off the number of sections also.
Right. And I think that goes, what the point I'm making goes back to what Jonathan was saying about needing to maybe revisit the board policy on transfers. So, three $20,000 transfers does meet the threshold of board approval. So that, for example, so I think that could be part of the broader discussion.
Whatever the board wants, we'll do it. We're trying to give you as much detail as possible. That's why you see these small amounts. And there is a level of specificity here. Certainly, if there's more specificity that the board wants, we'll do whatever you feel as if you need to make the right decisions. Our goal is to support kids all along the way and have teachers have what they need and not have to, quite frankly, beg, borrow, and steal when there's the ability to transfer and get the kids what they need in their hands. That's the bottom line.
Thank you for all of that.
Sorry, Dawn, we took you on a tangent on that one.
No, that's okay. Do you want to continue with the rest of those, or do we want to jump to the COVID real quick memo, and then there's that last agenda item that we may not get to?
Does
Ken, we lost you a little bit.
He froze again.
He actually, it's interesting. He doesn't freeze this time, just the volume.
That's the sound.
Fine.
Yeah.
I'll try again. I said I think we have the information in front of us, and really, Dawn's just reading it to us. It's going to be more of the same. Why don't we go ahead and go down to the COVID, unless anyone on the committee objects? I think we're good. Thanks, Dawn.
Okay, the COVID report didn't change very much at all, but I want to just bring your attention to what we'll start to see different in the financials as we align the expenses with the departments and the accounts that they need to be on in order for us to load that state report. So facilities, you have the $441,506 of expenses that are specific to facilities. Nurses and special education, there's a little bit in both of those. The nurses, I believe, are under the PPS department, and special education obviously under special education. Technology would be under technology, and curriculum would be under curriculum. So right now, all of those are shown in one account so that we could have tracked it. And the reason back when that was originated that way was because there was an agreement with the town. If we were to use the reserve account that was set aside, they wanted to see specifically all the unbudgeted COVID expenses and how they all relate to that particular agreement. But now that we're not using that money, I do need to start transferring. There's a lot of individual little lines. I need to start transferring those lines back where they belong so that they can be part of the actual expense report that we give to the state of Connecticut. Okay. Other than that, there's pretty much the only increases in the areas on this report were mainly in the salaries, a little bit of shift in the food service. You can see that the food service number didn't actually change from last month, and that's just a timing issue. We didn't pay the invoices for the food service as we're waiting for the state funds to come in that we get reimbursed on, so that we don't overdraw our account. So we were just waiting a couple more weeks. So it actually all occurred in April. So you'll see the change in April. Do that pretty quick. Is there anything specific? All right.
Rachel?
Thank you. Dawn, so just a couple of things. So it's good that we don't have to use the $633,542 for the carryover, but I just want to, a couple of things for the public watching. So we were able to capture that money last year in a carryover because of a health crisis that happened. That does not happen every year. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay, good.
And it was
I know that.
specific.
I've been having a lot of conversations with people, and they wanted to make sure that that is something that doesn't happen every year. And I told them that it was because of COVID.
So Rachel, in some communities, it could possibly happen, right? They could have the non-lapsing carryover available to the school district should they need it. In our community, it was not done that way. And it was very specific to COVID expenses that we could only use those funds for COVID expenses, which is why Dawn began this report to begin with, so that so we were as transparent as we could with the town in terms of understanding what the COVID expenses were.
Correct.
Absolutely. And then, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and the other part of the agreement that we had with the Board of Finance was that we would use all of our budget and any grants that we had prior to requesting any draw from that reserve account that they had set aside for us.
So right now at this point, if I go back to your report from the beginning, we will cover this 1.3 at this point with savings in other benefits, transportation, and then grants, and then ESSER 2. Are we going to use some of ESSER 2 to cover this as well?
So ESSER 2 is not used to cover this. So those monies, which we actually haven't received yet, Rachel, that grant was actually written by me. It was written with the 4 priorities. The first one being learning loss or learning acceleration. The second is social emotional needs. The third was technology. And the fourth, which is escaping me at this parent involvement. And so it was written, and we can move monies around within those 4 lines as time goes by, but that's the way in which the grant was written. So I used all 4 categories. I'll speak to this at the next Board of Education meeting when I provide an update. I did use all 4 categories, but it was not intended it's not written for COVID expenses. So as you know, we're having a summer program in June, but we're also having one in July, and funding will be used from the grant to support the July program K-12 and no cost to the parent. That's the first priority. The second is the social emotional wellness of kids. So as the school year 21-22 goes on, because we do understand that there'll be some residual impact, how we can support kids, whether it's through extended day or through a summer program, because not every child has access to the summer program, obviously. That's the plan.
Thank you.
And Rachel, to your question, so by statute in Connecticut, a school system in a town can agree to carry over up to 2% of that school system's budget into a carryover account. And the town can set parameters. The town and the school system can work together to set certain parameters, say that those monies aren't used for anything. They can be used specifically for unanticipated special education expenditures, whatever it happens to be. Here in Ridgefield, we've never gotten to an agreement with our Board of Finance to agree to that 2% carryover. The furthest we ever got was last year with the agreement to up to $700,000 for 1 year for COVID expenses if they weren't able to be handled within the operating budget of the schools. So that's a little bit more of the background around that.
Thank you.
Might be a little bit more of the background around some of the transfers as well.
Mhm.
All right, is everybody okay extending for a few more minutes to be able to talk about the last agenda item?
Yep, as long as you need.
Everyone on the committee good? Everybody's frozen. I can't see nods or thumbs, so.
All good.
All good.
All right,
Yes.
good.
All
All
good.
right. All right, Don?
I wanted to just bring this to this committee. This has, at the end of every audit that we have, the auditors come up with some recommendations that they would like to just put out there. We can follow the recommendations. We don't have to follow recommendations. And if we don't follow recommendations, they usually tend to show up year after year after year. In the case of this, for their recommendation, which is on the second page, fraud risk assessment, town and Board of Education. I was talking with Kevin Redmond over at the town. He also has to, or is going to start looking at having this process done. I wanted to just start the conversation on it. He would like to be able to budget for it and budget for it in the next year, which would be 2023, which would give time for us to, if we need to RFP, we don't know what the expense is going to be for something like this, or to find a third party to come in and do the assessment. We can do the assessment individually, or we can do the assessment, have the same outside vendor come in and do the assessment, one for the board and a different one for the town, or one for both locations in both areas. But it is a recommendation. It's quite lengthy. I don't have a lot of detail on it. I did ask our auditors to give me some background as to what fraud risk assessment, what that entails, how long it takes, and what's the average cost for some type of a review like that. I don't have the specifics on that yet from them. So far, all the other recommendations are being covered. Just this one has been out there for 3 years now, I believe.
And Don, that's not something that our auditors do even on it's just interesting. Okay.
Yeah, no. And I asked her and she said, no, it's a total different department within the audit firm that handles this. It's not the ones who come and do the regular audit for our financials.
Which is interesting because it is literally the exact same internal controls.
Yes, it is.
Your internal, so it is interesting and a bit of a money grab on their part.
Yes, it is.
And particularly annoying since that's what I get to do every day. All right, yes, I would be very interested in hearing what they have to say ultimately.
Okay, so I'll once I get more information from them, I'll bring that forward at the next meeting. And I just will let you know that on the front page, there is a recommendation that we continue with our process. We had there not been a restriction on traveling, we would have had our vendor in to help us finalize all of our balance sheet accounts. That's something that the Board of Education has never had on their books. We just never had balance sheet accounts prior to my getting here. So we need to have them set up, but we need to have them set up, but then also linked all the way through in the background. And that's something that we need their assistance with to make sure it's done right and that it flows and we can get reports on it. They weren't able to come out and help us finish that. And so as soon as they are able to travel again, they'll be back out and we'll be completing that process.
Is that a system issue?
it's the way the system was set up whenever the system was set up for the Board of Education, there was just expenses. We don't even really have revenue accounts. It
Well,
was
no,
just set up.
I understand it's more to the point of why weren't they able to do that remotely? I mean, if they can get in and this is how your ledger set up, this is how your account.
Our software, our server, our actual is in-house. It's not a cloud-based. They can get in, but they can't do whatever it is that they need to do without being in our building.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Rachel?
Dawn, just a clarification of language in the letter. So I just want to point out, so you're the one that's doing the hard work behind the scenes, right? I mean, because they didn't come back to us and ask for additional information. It says as needed from the Board of Education. I mean,
When they
no one
mention when they mention the board, they mention any employee of the board as being the board. It's kind of weird how they have their terminology. It's very confusing. Yeah. We
but
consider ourselves Ridgefield Public Schools. We consider you the board, but that's not always the terminology that's used.
Okay.
You'll see that in a lot of the policies too, Rachel, and I know you're on the policy committee, is it says the Board of Education when it doesn't really necessarily mean the actual board, but the employees of the board.
I just wanted to give you credit where credit was due because, you know,
Thank you.
necessary. Welcome.
All right. Is there anything else that anyone wants to discuss tonight about our agenda items? All right. Can I get a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Move to adjourn.
Liz, second. Sean
Woohoo.
and Rachel. Ooh, we got a third on that too. All right. Thank
Thanks,
you all
everybody.
very much.
Thank you,
And we'll
everybody.
see you next week.
You
You
guys.
guys.
Thank you.
Everyone be safe.